You think transcending material concerns means rejecting the physical world or achieving supernatural powers. Maslow discovered something far more nuanced in his final research. He found that certain self-actualized individuals underwent what he called transcendence, not escape from material reality, but fundamental shift in how they related to it psychologically. These highly developed people were experiencing material existence differently while living completely functional physical lives. The most significant part? Maslow identified specific signs that indicate someone has moved beyond what he called self-actualization into transcendence, a stage where material concerns no longer dominate consciousness, even while you continue meeting material needs. This isn't about levitating or performing miracles. This is about a psychological shift where your identity, motivation, and perception are no longer primarily organized around material reality, even though you remain fully engaged with it. And recognizing these signs means understanding the difference between healthy transcendence and unhealthy dissociation from physical reality. Not every person who seems detached from material concerns is experiencing healthy transcendence. There's a critical difference between what Maslow called genuine transcendence and several pathological states that superficially resemble it. He observed that some people appearing unattached to material reality were actually depressed and unable to engage, dissociated from trauma, and disconnected from their bodies, in spiritual bypass using philosophy to avoid practical responsibilities, or in manic states where they felt invulnerable to physical consequences. But the pattern he documented in Transcenders was fundamentally different. These were psychologically healthy people who fully engaged with material reality when necessary, earning money, maintaining health, meeting responsibilities. But their sense of identity, worth, and meaning was no longer dependent on material circumstances. They could lose everything externally and remain psychologically intact because their primary orientation had shifted to something material conditions couldn't threaten. This wasn't denial of physical reality. This was freedom from psychological dependence on it. What appears as detachment from material concerns is actually mastery of relationship with them. You engage fully without being controlled by attachment or fear. Real transcendence, according to Maslow's research, includes rather than excludes material reality, but from completely different psychological position. In this video, I'm going to reveal what Maslow discovered about transcendence, the stage beyond self-actualization, where material reality no longer dominates consciousness, based on his final years of research before his death. You'll discover the 7 specific signs that indicate you've undergone this psychological shift, why transcendence doesn't mean rejecting physical reality, but transforming your relationship to it, and how to distinguish healthy transcendence from pathological dissociation or spiritual bypass. These are insights from Maslow's late career work and contemporary psychology that explain the highest levels of human development he documented. By the end, you'll understand whether what you're experiencing is genuine transcendence or something requiring different response. This isn't a video promoting supernatural beliefs, spiritual superiority, or rejection of material responsibility. This is humanistic psychology explaining how consciousness can shift its primary orientation beyond material concerns while remaining fully functional in material reality. This video is for people who've noticed they no longer care about things that used to matter, who feel increasingly detached from material outcomes without being depressed, who sense their identity has shifted to something material circumstances can't threaten. If you can lose possessions without devastation, face financial uncertainty without terror, or watch your body age without crisis, you might be experiencing what Maslow documented. But critical warning, genuine transcendence includes healthy engagement with material reality, not escape from it. If you're ready to understand the psychology of the highest developmental stage Maslow identified, keep watching. Think about your relationship to money, possessions, physical appearance, status, or material security right now. Notice what happens in your consciousness when you imagine losing these things. For most people, the response is immediate anxiety or terror. Their psychological stability depends on maintaining these material conditions. This is normal at lower developmental levels where identity and worth are entangled with material circumstances. Maslow understood that when you're operating from deficiency needs, material reality feels like the primary reality because it's where those needs get met or threatened. But he documented that certain individuals had undergone a shift so profound that material loss no longer created existential crisis. They would feel practical concern, needing to solve problems, rebuild, adapt, but not psychological devastation, because their fundamental sense of self wasn't invested in material conditions. The psychological weight of this shift is that it creates a kind of invulnerability to circumstances while maintaining full engagement with them. You're playing material game fully, but you're no longer identified with your position in it. You can win or lose excellently while remaining internally stable, because what you most fundamentally are has been recognized as something material conditions don't define. This is what Maslow meant by transcendence. Not that you've left the material world, but that the material world no longer has ultimate power over your psychological state. Maslow's hierarchy provides a framework for understanding why transcendence only appears after self-actualization is substantially completed. At levels 1 through 4, physiological needs, safety, love and belonging, esteem, you're building and maintaining a healthy ego structure. You need material security, social connection, and personal achievement to develop psychological health. This is necessary and appropriate developmental work. At level 5, self-actualization, you've satisfied those needs and your consciousness orients toward growth, creativity, and authentic self-expression. Material concerns matter, but they're not existential. You have enough security and self-worth that temporary material setbacks don't destroy you. But Maslow discovered that some self-actualized people underwent further transformation into what he called transcendence. Here's where it gets profound. Transcenders had shifted their primary identity from the individual self to something larger. They increasingly experience themselves as part of or expressions of something that transcends individual existence, whether they called it consciousness, nature, humanity, the cosmos, or simply reality itself. This wasn't belief or philosophy. It was direct experiential shift in what they felt themselves to be. Here's the insight that changes everything. When your identity shifts from I am this individual person to I am consciousness temporarily expressing as this person, or I am the universe experiencing itself through this form, material circumstances affecting the individual form become relatively less significant. They still matter practically. The form needs food, shelter, health, but they don't matter existentially because what you most fundamentally identify as isn't limited to the form. This is psychological transcendence of material identification, not supernatural transcendence of material reality. Your body remains fully physical, subject to all physical laws, but your consciousness has recognized itself as something physical conditions don't ultimately define or destroy. Maslow found this pattern consistently in what he called transcenders. They lived fully in material reality while no longer being psychologically controlled by it. The philosopher Alan Watts spent decades explaining Eastern concepts of transcendence to Western audiences. He emphasized that transcendence doesn't mean leaving the world, but seeing through the illusion that the material self is what you ultimately are. His work showed that many spiritual traditions teach this shift, from identification with form to recognition of consciousness as primary, and that this shift produces exactly the freedom from material attachment that Maslow documented. The psychologist Ken Wilber studied developmental stages across multiple frameworks and confirmed Maslow's finding that transcendence appears as a recognizable stage beyond healthy ego development. His research showed that this shift involves what he called transegoic development, not destruction of ego, but evolution beyond ego identification. The neuroscientist Sam Harris studied meditation and consciousness, documenting how sustained contemplative practice can produce shifts where sense of self transforms from feeling located in the body to feeling like the space in which body and mind appear. His work provided mechanistic understanding of psychological processes. Maslow observed, these aren't supernatural events, but natural potentials of consciousness that rarely activate without specific developmental conditions. The spiritual teacher Eckhart Tolle wrote extensively about what he calls presence or awakening, describing it as shift from identifying with thoughts and form to recognizing yourself as the awareness in which they appear. His descriptions closely match what Maslow called transcendence, not leaving material reality, but changing your relationship to it through shift in identity. Insider knowledge from both contemplative traditions and consciousness research confirms what Maslow documented. Human development can continue beyond healthy ego into stages where ego is retained as functional structure but transcended as identity, producing freedom from material identification while maintaining material engagement. But here's what Maslow discovered about the specific signs that indicate genuine transcendence versus problematic dissociation from material reality. The first sign he identified is continued functional engagement despite detachment. Transcenders maintain or even improve their practical effectiveness. They earn income, maintain health, meet responsibilities, while being psychologically less attached to outcomes. They're not escaping material reality. They're engaging from freedom rather than fear. If you're neglecting practical needs or responsibilities, that's not transcendence. That's dissociation or avoidance. But if you're meeting practical needs while caring less about status or accumulation, that may indicate transcendence. The second sign is what Maslow called increased identification with universal or cosmic concerns. Your sense of identity expands beyond personal and even beyond human to include connection with nature, humanity, or existence itself. You increasingly experience yourself as part of a larger whole rather than as isolated individual. This isn't grandiosity. Transcenders don't claim to be special or superior. It's recognition of interconnection that feels like coming home to larger identity you'd forgotten. The third sign is decreased ego defensiveness without increased vulnerability. Transcenders become remarkably non-defensive. They can hear criticism, admit mistakes, acknowledge limitations without the ego threat that normally accompanies these. But they're not more easily hurt or damaged. They're actually more resilient because their sense of worth isn't dependent on being right, successful, or admired. They've maintained healthy ego boundaries while transcending ego identification. The fourth sign is what Maslow called integration of opposites. Contradictions that normally create psychological conflict become unified. Material and spiritual, sacred and profane, serious and playful, life and death. These stop being opposing categories and become recognized as different aspects of unified reality. You can be deeply engaged with material work while recognizing its ultimate emptiness, or face death while seeing it as transformation rather than annihilation. This is an intellectual understanding. It's experiential recognition that dissolves internal conflict. The fifth sign Maslow documented is increased peak experiences and becognition. Transcenders have what used to be rare peak experiences with increasing frequency, sometimes becoming almost their baseline consciousness. They spend more time in what Maslow called being cognition, perceiving reality without judgment or self-reference, seeing things as they are rather than through filter of personal need. Material objects and circumstances are perceived in their isness rather than their usefulness to you. The sixth sign is moral elevation and universal compassion. Your ethical concern expands beyond your tribe, nation, or even species to include all beings and existence itself. This is an abstract philosophy. It's felt experience of connection that makes causing harm feel like harming yourself. But this universal compassion includes discrimination. Transcenders help where they actually can rather than feeling responsible for all suffering everywhere. The seventh sign, and perhaps most definitive, is what Maslow called comfortable relationship with mortality. Transcenders have fundamentally transformed their relationship to death. Not denial, not defeat, but recognition that what they most deeply are isn't the thing that dies. Many reported no longer fearing death even while preferring to continue living. They'd recognize consciousness itself as their primary identity, and consciousness, while taking individual forms that die, isn't it self-born or destroyed. This wasn't belief imposed for comfort, but direct perception that shifted everything. These seven signs cluster in genuine transcendence. You might not have all seven equally developed, but if you recognize several while maintaining functional material engagement, you may be experiencing what Maslow documented rather than dissociation or bypass. The critical distinction is that transcendence includes and integrates material reality from a higher perspective rather than rejecting or escaping it. You're in the world but not ultimately of it, psychologically free while physically engaged. The transformation that occurs when you undergo genuine transcendence creates specific changes in how you navigate material reality even though you remain fully in it. Remember that anxiety about financial security, that attachment to possessions or status, that fear of material loss that used to drive so much behavior? When transcendence occurs, these dramatically decrease not because you're ignoring practical concerns, but because your psychological stability no longer depends on material conditions. You address practical needs from clarity rather than desperation. Your relationship to your body transforms significantly. You continue maintaining health, eating well, exercising, getting medical care, but the aging, illness, or eventual death of the body no longer creates existential crisis because you recognize yourself as consciousness inhabiting this form temporarily rather than as the form itself. You care for the body the way you maintain a vehicle you're traveling in, with respect and appropriate attention, but without identifying as a vehicle. Your material choices often simplify. Transcenders frequently reduce possessions, simplify lifestyles, and become less concerned with acquisition not from imposed asceticism, but from genuine recognition that material accumulation doesn't provide what they actually want. They have enough to meet needs, but stop pursuing excess because the motivation, filling psychological deficiency through material means, has dissolved. Your work often transforms toward contribution rather than achievement. You continue working, often productively, but the motivation shifts from proving yourself or securing your position to expressing your nature or serving something larger. Success and failure become less personally significant because your worth isn't at stake in outcomes. Even your fear, across multiple domains, decreases substantially. When material conditions no longer threaten your fundamental sense of self, you live with reduced chronic anxiety. You still experience appropriate fear in dangerous situations, but the background existential fear that drives so much human behavior largely dissolves. Now here's where everything Maslow discovered reveals its complete significance, and where understanding transcendence becomes about recognizing the furthest development of human consciousness he documented. What distinguishes transcendence from spiritual bypass, dissociation, or pathological detachment comes down to several crucial factors. First, continued functional competence. Transcenders remain effective in material reality. They can earn income, maintain relationships, solve practical problems. Their transcendence includes rather than excludes material engagement. If you're neglecting practical responsibilities, you're not transcending, you're avoiding. Second, integration rather than rejection of previous stages. Transcenders have completed ego development before transcending ego identification. They have healthy self-esteem before moving beyond needing it. They've met material needs before becoming detached from material outcomes. Transcendence isn't skipping stages. It's integrating all previous development into larger frame. If you're trying to transcend before developing healthy ego and meeting basic needs, you're engaging in spiritual bypass that will create problems. Third, increase compassion and connection rather than isolation. Transcenders feel more connected to others in existence, not less. They're withdrawing from social performance, but not from genuine relationship. If your detachment from material reality includes emotional flatness or inability to connect, that's dissociation, not transcendence. Fourth, peace rather than numbness. Transcendence brings profound peace that comes from recognizing what you are beyond conditions. Dissociation brings numbness that comes from disconnecting from feeling. If you feel nothing, that's not transcendence. If you feel profound okayness, even while experiencing the full range of emotions, that may be. Fifth, continued growth and engagement with life. Transcenders remain curious, creative, and engaged with existence even while detached from outcomes. They're not done with life. They're living it more fully from freedom. If you've lost interest in living or growing, that's not transcendence. That's depression or resignation. These distinctions allow honest assessment of whether what you're experiencing is the highest development Maslow documented or something requiring different response. Maslow's final insight about transcendence, written in his journals before his death, was that this stage appears to be available to human consciousness, but rarely reached because most people either never complete self-actualization, the prerequisite stage, or complete it but don't continue developing beyond it. He estimated that perhaps 2% of the population reaches self-actualization, and perhaps 1 to 5% of those reach transcendence, meaning transcenders might be 1 in 5,000 to 1 in 10,000 people. This isn't elitism, but recognition of how rare this development is. Most people live their entire lives identified with their material selves, operating from deficiency needs, and die having never questioned whether they are what they think they are. This is normal and acceptable. There's nothing wrong with it. But there exists potential for development beyond that norm, and some people, through circumstances, practice, or natural development, undergo the shift Maslow documented. If you recognize these signs in yourself, If material circumstances have genuinely lost their existential power while you remain functionally engaged, you're potentially experiencing rare psychological development. This doesn't make you better than others. Transcenders consistently report decreased sense of being special or superior, but it does mean you're navigating territory most people never access, and understanding what's happening helps you work with it rather than being confused by it. The shift from material identification to transcendent perspective is profound, often disorienting, and can feel isolating because so few people share the experience. But it's documented, studied, and represents potential that exists in human consciousness, even if rarely actualized. In the next video, I'm going to reveal how transcenders maintain functional lives while operating from this shifted perspective, including the specific challenges they face that people at lower developmental levels never encounter, and the practices that support stable transcendence versus unstable dissociation. Until then, if you're experiencing genuine transcendence, understand that you've not overcome matter literally. Matter still fully constrains your body, but you've undergone psychological shift where matter no longer constrains your sense of identity, and that creates a freedom that most humans never taste. Subscribe if you want to understand the complete psychology of the highest developmental stages Maslow documented, including the territory beyond self-actualization that psychology barely acknowledges exists.